Hello everyone, Scientia here with the Curses part of the Guild Wars 1 skill review project on the Necromancer. Section on the Necromancer, I should say. So yeah, Curses is the next attribute we're going to be talking about here. There are 49 skills in Curses for some reason. It has a lot of skills. I think there were some skills that were in no attribute at one point in time that were moved to Curses, although I'd have to double check that to confirm. But Necromancer has shockingly few no attribute skills and a lot of curses, so that would kind of check out. Anyway, let's jump right into it with Atrophy. Atrophy is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20-second recharge, hex spell. For 6 seconds, target foe's primary attribute is reduced to 0. Okay, so this is a very interesting skill in that it is extremely powerful in PvP, and almost worthless in PvE. Its primary uses are going to be, obviously, shutting down certain effects. So it's going to be useful for making Necromancers have slightly less energy gain, making Mesmers cast more slowly, but most critically, it's going to make Monks heal less, because it would shut down Divine Favor for that period of time. That's really the most of it. Like, Ranger and Dervish, it really hurts by making their skills more expensive. Both of them have primary attributes that decrease certain the energy cost of certain types of skills. Ranger is, of course, more hurt by that than Dervish. Assassin also will have some energy troubles for a little bit. But here's the thing, is like, this doesn't last very long unless they have a lot of skills in their primary attribute. It just doesn't do that much. So this can be quite nasty in PvP, where taking out somebody's primary attribute like that, particularly a monk or something, can really damage their ability to function. It can be a good counter to certain builds, potentially, if they're using a lot of primary attribute skills, but it's a really interesting, unique effect, and I'm giving it a 1, because I have no idea when I would ever want something like this in PvE. Like, reducing my enemy's primary attribute to 0. Most primary attributes don't have that many skills. This isn't going to be negatively impacting enemies' skills that much. You could do some research to determine like if this is going to help a little bit. But the thing is, this is only one foe. It's for a fairly short duration. It just does not do that much in PvE. And I'd say it does so little, it's never worth bringing. So that's why I'm giving it a 1. I think it's a really cool design space. I like what it's trying to play around with. But it is much, much more interesting in PvP, where you're going to be facing fewer opponents, and doing this to one of them can be quite devastating for a short period of time. But even then, it's questionable. So, cool space to play around in, but just doesn't quite do enough to really matter in the end for me. Barbs. Barbs is 10 energy, 2 second cast time, 5 second recharge. It is a hex spell for 30 seconds, which is a nice hardy duration. Target foe takes 12 more damage when hit by physical damage. So basically, whenever physical damage is dealt to an enemy, so that's going to be piercing, blunt, or slashing, they take an additional 12 armor ignoring damage. This is extremely powerful. I'm going to give this a 4. So it is good in a couple of situations. It's good if you have a bunch of physical attackers, although keep in mind you do need to be dealing physical damage. So that is a restriction on it. Again, this comes up with like the bonus weapons that you can get with slash bonus if you have access to those. Since a bunch of those deal elemental damage, they do not trigger barbs. It also works really well with minions because the minions deal physical damage. So you slap barbs on something with minions around and they will deal a lot more damage. The other thing is like, only a 5 second recharge and a 30 second duration means that you can spread this around quite a lot. And so this adds a ton of additional damage. It is really quite devastating in that regard. So I like this one quite a bit. It's a nice complement as well to, and I'd probably bring on a different Necromancer, but it's a nice complement to Orders. So I'd probably have, like, if I was doing that, I'd have an Orders Necromancer and then a Curses Necromancer with Barbs. In general, Curses and Death Magic are going to be more useful broadly than Blood Magic, but the Order build in particular is just so energy intensive that trying to fit Barbs onto it is a bit dubious. Although I guess you could do it with Cultist's Fervor, because that would make it cheap enough that you could actually kind of slot it in there. But yeah, it's quite strong, and I quite like it. Okay, this brings us to Cacophony. It is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge, hex spell. For 10 seconds, whenever target foe uses a shout or chant, that foe takes 90 damage. Okay, so here's the thing. This is a specific counter to shouts and chants. Let's scroll down a little bit. I'm going to talk about some of these skills later. But Vocal Minority, for 17 seconds, target foe and all nearby foes cannot use shouts or chants. And Ulcerous Lungs, for 22 seconds, target foe and all nearby foes suffer from -4 health regeneration when bleeding, and whenever they use a shout or chant, they bleed for 13 seconds. And Well of Silence, exploit target corpse. Exploit a corpse. You don't target the corpse. It's going to be the corpse nearest your target, probably. To create a Well of Silence for 26 seconds, foes within the well cannot use shouts or chants and suffer -3 health regeneration. All of these are better against shouts and chants than what is this one? Cacophony is. Cacophony is really, really weak. It's single target. All of the other ones are AoE. It does do a nice chunk of damage, so it hits really hard if they use it, but this requires the enemy to be spamming it, which they may or may not. But the other ones also have either other beneficial effects or just straight up shut it down. And this lasts 10 seconds. How long did Vocal Minority? Oh, this is 17 seconds. This lasts longer, shuts down all shouts and chants. Like, basically what I'm saying is, like, this is a nice counter to shouts or chants. It's a little weak. And this exact same attribute line has 3 skills that are preferable to it. One, because it's, like, well, 2 of them because they straight out stop shouts and chants in an area of effect. And another because it has additional effects. So, and all of those are AoE. So this to me is a 1. It is a sort of a counter. And 90 damage is certainly nasty. But there are other, like, here's the thing. Like, if you're trying to kill your enemies, obviously Cacophony is not, or Cacophony is a little bit better at killing a specific enemy spamming shouts and chants than the other ones. But there are plenty of ways to kill enemies. There might be, like, a boss out there or something where this is, like, useful. But bluntly put, I don't have many instances in which I care to make use of this, and if I wanted to stop shouts or chants, like, I want to stop them, not just punish somebody for using them. There are better, like, punishing effects out there. These don't come up enough. Yada yada yada. I think I've kind of explained my point here. There are stronger counters, and that's really what it comes down to. Chillblains, 25 energy, which is very hefty. 25 energy is very, very large on a Necromancer. It is much more palatable on an Elementalist. But anyway, let's go ahead and read what this does. It is 2-second cast time, 8-second recharge, which is quite low. Spell. You become poisoned for 10 seconds. Okay. Foes in the area of your target, which is going to include your target, and in the area is the largest one. So it's short from like earshot range and spirit range and stuff. But it goes adjacent, nearby, in the area. So this is quite large. So foes in the area of your target are struck for 37 cold damage and lose 2 enchantments. This is an incredibly powerful anti-enchantment spell. I'm going to give this a 2. This is bluntly overkill for the vast majority of areas. If you have a zone where enemies are going to be spamming enchantments, a variety of enchantments on themselves, and you want to get rid of them, so really good example of this is Madness Titans in the Realm of Torment. They will enchant themselves with blocking and regenerating enchantments and stuff. This is a really great way of cleaning stuff up. It is like, in terms of like what it does, it is extraordinarily powerful. Only an 8-second recharge and removing 2 enchantments is so strong. But like I said, this is like Most of the time you can just fix the problem simply, like, basically this is saying we need a tank to take care of something that you can do with, like, a handgun. I mean, it's kind of the comparison here, where it's just like this is the super option. So keep in mind that it's there, it's in your back pocket, it has huge cost, poisoning you for 10 seconds, 25 energy, so you don't want to just use this willy-nilly, but if you know you're going into an area where there's the right situation for this is a very, 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 very powerful way of dealing with lots of enchantments. So, okay, let's go ahead and move on to Corrupt Enchantment. So this is 5 energy, 3/4 second cast time, 10-second recharge, elite hex spell. Remove 1 enchantment from target foe. If an enchantment is removed in this way, that foe suffers from -7 health degeneration for 10 seconds. So this is, I think, one of the faster recharging enchantment removal spells. Obviously, Chillblains is quicker, but for only 5 energy, especially like single target ones, this is super cheap. The health degen is really powerful, but this is an elite. And spending your elite slot on enchantment removal is questionable. This would be absolutely phenomenal if it wasn't an elite, obviously. But if it wasn't an elite, it would have a longer recharge and probably less health degen and stuff. I'm not really going to bring this in PvE, though. There's just... If I'm going to be dealing with enchantments, I'm going to want to not be spending my elite slot on it. I'm going to want to be dealing... that's really it, right? I don't want to be spending my elite slot on dealing with enchantments. So I'm going to give this a 2. The effect is strong, but I don't want to spend my elite slot on enchantment removal. There's just not enough enchantments going around to warrant that. And something like Mirror of Disenchantment is going to take care of the problems most of the time. Or Rip Enchantment, which we'll get to later. So, powerful design, but the competition among elites for what they do is specific enough that this is just not broadly applicable enough. So, okay. Defiled Defenses. 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 5 second recharge, hex spell for 17 seconds. The next time target foe blocks, that foe takes 102 damage. So, that means that it ends after dealing that damage. This is one of those spells that is really interesting to read. The 102 damage is nice, but honestly, so there are better ways to deal with blocking foes. There are better ways, in fact, in this, where is it? It's in here somewhere, I think. Yeah, right here. Rigor Mortis is a hex that just stops them from being able to block. That's going to deal more damage to them than Defiled Defenses is. So, unfortunately, what this is like, this would be really interesting if it was just like for 17 seconds, whenever target foe blocks, they take 30 damage, 20 damage, something like that. 17, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what would be fair, but basically that effect, like if this was all triggered on every block, that would, but is a much lesser amount of damage, probably had slightly different stats. That would be way more interesting, way more exciting. As it is, this is just kind of I want to stop my opponent from being able to block more than I want to punish them for having blocked, if that makes sense. So, unfortunately for me, I'm going to give this one a 1 again. It does something, but it's so... like, that's not what I want to do. That's not how I want to respond to my opponent blocking, by dealing them 102 damage once. Keep in mind, too, like, this has to go on them and then they have to block. So you have to be going into an area where you know enemies do block things. You have to put this on an enemy that's going to block something. And then you have to attack them. Like, that's not too big of a leap, that last part. Put this on the enemy and then attack them when they're going to be able to block it. But it's just... if this was area of effect, it would probably be like a 2 or a 3. But single target, just punish their next block, is just not quite enough. That's not quite how I want to respond to blocking. So, interesting idea. Execution needs some more spice to make me interested in it. Defile enchantments and Desecrate enchantments are clones. The original one was Desecrate, and then Factions gave us Defile enchantments. Same skill, though. 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge. Target foe and all nearby foes take 49 shadow damage and 17 shadow damage for each enchantment on them. So this specifically is to punish having enchantments. It's kind of an interesting one that way. It is definitely better if you are going into an area where the enemies have a lot of enchantments on them, but this is pretty large area of effect at being that nearby range, and it is armor ignoring. To me, these guys are 3s. I don't bring them a lot of the time. I have brought them in the past. They're okay. They're not exciting per se, but they can get some really cool hits off. If you do hit something with a lot of enchantments on it, you can get some pretty cool numbers going off on these. But that doesn't happen a ton. But they're cool designs. It's a nice way to punish enchantments and mass enchantments in a different way than just trying to remove them. And it does so in a way that's more engaging than some of the other ones. So I like where this one sits. It is a solid option, but not an outstanding one, or even an amazing one. Defile Flesh. 10 health sacrifice. 10% I should say. 10 energy, 1-second cast time, 10-second recharge, hex spell. For 29 seconds, target foe gains only 2/3 health from healing. So this is a healing nerf. I don't bring this. Obviously it makes your target die a lot more easily. I should note that there is Lingering Curse, which is area of effect and has a bit of that effect on. It reduces healing by 20%. Deep Wound also reduces healing by 20%. So this is not a unique effect. I'm going to give this one... It's a very generous 2. It does do something useful in that if you are going into an area where you're struggling with killing enemies, you can put this on enemies to make them easier to kill. But it's very dubious. It's a very, very, very low 2. Actually, you know what? It's so low. I'm gonna revise it. I'm gonna make this a 1. I don't know when I want this. So there are other ways that you can address healing happening. One of them is using Lingering Curse, like I mentioned, which is area of effect. Another is just dealing more damage. And then there's things that specifically are trying to shut down their healers. There's ways that you can try to punish them. We'll get to that later. This is not how I want to stop healing. I want to have better targeting or things like that. If this had more of an area of effect, if it was like adjacent or something like that, I would maybe give it that 2. But as it is, it's just meh. Depravity. 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge. By the way, I should mention before I move on that the Defile Flesh effect of reducing healing is actually a really good one to have in the game, and it's a really good idea to have. I do wish enemies used this more. I don't know if there's any enemies that actually cast Defile Flesh. Things like this are good to have in the game. They make you have to address things that you don't otherwise. It's just, I'm not going to use this one because what it does is a bit too, weak, and there are kind of other ways to kind of get to that effect. For me to want to bring this, but I think this is a great option for enemies to use on the players and stuff like that. So I think it fits in a nice spot in the game, and I like the design that it's going for. It's just the nature of the way PvE plays out in this game. This is not a skill I'm typically going to bring. I could see bringing it against if you're really struggling with a Prophecies boss, like a Prophecies monk boss, like a Mursat monk or something, that's this thing is super tanky and I'm just not able to take it down. Something like this will make that easier, although keep in mind it will only last half duration. You can still keep it up 100% of the time, but I think there are better ways to address even that. So, I mean, it's your mileage will vary, but I don't think it's going to vary very high. So, a good design, but an underwhelming one, if that makes sense. Okay, Depravity. It is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge, elite hex spell. For 17 seconds, whenever target foe casts a spell, that foe and one nearby foe lose 4 energy. I think this had slightly different effects at one point in time. I think it might have been all nearby foes lose energy, but not the one... I don't remember. But I think it became super powerful in PvP or something. This is a 2 for me in general, so I'm not going to bring this under most circumstances. Just making enemies randomly lose energy when they cast spells is nice. It helps. It helps apply pressure and things like that. But for the most part, enemies are going to die fast enough anyway. The only time I'd really consider Depravity is if I was specifically making some sort of energy denial build, in which case Depravity fits nicely into that. And I would certainly pick it over something like Wither for that particular build. We'll see Wither later. It's going to be like the last skill we talk about, but it has some energy denial aspects to it. But yeah, Depravity can be a nice part of that sort of build. So definitely something to consider there, but I'm not going to just use this casually, if that makes sense. Desecrate enchantments. We already talked about. It was fine. Moving on. Enfeeble. This is like the standard weakness spell. It is 5 energy, quarter second cast time, 5-second recharge. Spell. Target suffers from weakness for 26 seconds. It is perfectly fine. It is a 3. I'm not going to bring this a lot of the time because the next spell exists. But yeah, like this is your standard apply weakness. You want those sorts of effects in the game. You want your standard sort of straightforward, oh, this does the thing. Let's move on in terms of that, though, because Enfeebling Blood is going to be my pick most of the time for my Inflict Weakness in Necromancer slot. It is 10% health sacrifice, 1 energy, real low, 1 second cast time, 8-second recharge, which is low enough. Spell, target foe, and all nearby foes suffer from weakness for 17 seconds. This has a big area of effect on it. I'm going to give this a 5. I'm often wanting to bring this when I'm bringing a Necromancer. Not always, like this won't always fit into the Minion Master build, for example, because Minion Master tends to be very attribute heavy, but this certainly can fit onto that build. So this is very strong. This is an excellent way of applying area of effect weakness. It has a big area of effect. Weakness is a very useful condition to spread around because it reduces damage that enemies deal with attacks, and that is really important. Being able to do that can save you a ton of pain. So it's a really useful condition to have. This is one of the best ways of getting it around on enemies. Big area of effect, low energy cost, low recharge, extremely useful in that regard. So this and another skill that we're going to find later down here somewhere. Weaken Armor, which applies Cracked Armor, are 2 condition inflicting spells in curses that I'm often bringing on the Necromancers that I run in my party, just because it's very useful to be able to spread those conditions around. Enfeebling Touch. This is 5 energy, 3/4 second cast time, 5-second recharge. Actually, I guess it's an activation time because it's a skill, not a spell. Target touched foe loses 41 health and suffers from weakness for 17 seconds. So you're mostly using this for the weakness infliction. Unfortunately, this is not great for primary Necromancer. I don't want to be running up to enemies. I could see using this if for some reason you are using curses with melee attacks. I'm actually more likely to go into blood magic if I'm for some reason doing like a melee Necromancer. Although there are some arguments for going into curses such as Plague Touch, which we'll talk about later, which is a touch range skill. So I'm not a big fan of this one. Enfeebling Blood is what I'm going to bring most of the time, or Enfeeble. Enfeeble is very similar stats to this. It actually casts a little bit faster. It does not deal the damage, but does not require touch range. So I'm going to give this one a 2. I think that there are circumstances where I could see using it on a melee attacker, but I'm probably not going to use it on a general Necromancer. But I appreciate that something like this does exist. Envenom Enchantments. 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 20-second recharge. Spell. Target foe loses 1 enchantment. For every remaining enchantment, target foe is poisoned for 9 seconds. So to me, this one is like not great. It requires them to have multiple enchantments to be more than just target foe loses 1 enchantment, right? And it has a 20-second recharge. The issue here is that most of the enchantment removal I'm looking at has a 15-second recharge. So you have to be having a really nice bonus effect to make me be like, yeah, 20 energy or more than 5 energy, or 20-second recharge, or more than 15-second recharge and more than 5 energy to cast. Like, you have to be doing something really useful to make me not just bring Mirror of Disenchantment, which no attribute in Mesmer is a great way of removing enchantments. So this doesn't. It's perfectly adequate, but they do have to have additional enchantments to be able to poison them, and that's not exciting to me. So yeah, I'm gonna give this one like a 3. It's perfectly serviceable, but it is terribly unexciting. Which brings us to faint-heartedness. I'm actually going to take a few points out of there because I want to check something. Yeah. So there's a bunch of hexes and curses that have a breakpoint at 13, which means that like breakpoints haven't come up a whole lot so far, but a breakpoint is basically referring to some effect that has a very small scaling amount. So, for example, this health degeneration is at -2 right now on faint-heartedness. I guess I might as well read this first. Faint-heartedness is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 8 second recharge, hex spell for the next 13 seconds. Target foe attacks 50% slower, so that at half attack rate, which does dramatically decrease damage from auto-attacking. And they also suffer from -2 health degeneration. If I bump this up to 13 curses, it will be -3 health degeneration, which is obviously super preferable. So there's some effects that have a fairly broad scaling where like every point you put into that attribute raises the effect by at least 1. So for example, I imagine this duration is kind of like that, where if I take curses way down, the duration gets shorter, and up. It's very sort of y equals x sort of linear scale, where the attribute increase has a very direct effect. So there's not like a good spot to get to. Whereas there's others like faint-heartedness or in blood magic, life siphon, which was at 12 that it had its breakpoint, where the effect that scaling is fairly small, but significant. So a good example is right here, where the health regen going from 2 to 3 is a important bump. And so this going from 2 to 3 at 13, this is actually more important for Lingering Curse and the non-elite version of that, Suffering, which we will be talking about. These are also -2 health degeneration at 12 curses, but -3 at 13 curses. That's pretty important. It means that these are way better on Necromancer, because getting up to that threshold really makes them a lot more dangerous. Faint-heartedness, it matters less for, just because you're primarily bringing this for the slower attack speed than the health degen, though the health degen is a nice part of pressure. This is a nice sort of classic Necromancer effect. I really like the design space this is playing around in, of like, I am whittling you away. You're becoming less effective, and you're slowly dying. It's really nice to see a Necromancer where you have these like, my primary effect is this, but here's also some health degen just for bonus points. There's a few skills like that, and faint-heartedness is one of them. This is a 3, though, for me. It's not something I bring a lot. Again, you're not really bringing this for the health degen. It's a bit too weak and a bit too expensive for that. There are plenty of ways to get -3 health degen that do not require you to use a single target hex. You're bringing this because it makes the target attack 50% slower. And the simple fact of the matter is, there's this lovely skill right here called Shadow of Fear, which is Area of Effect. Enemies attack slower. I'm going to want that more often than faint-heartedness if I'm going for that sort of thing. So that's really kind of the main issue with faint-heartedness. It's preferable in a one-on-one situation, but those don't really come up in most PvE scenarios. Something to keep in mind, I suppose, if you do want to decrease attack rate in against a single target in PvE, because you're doing some sort of quest that's kind of more of a dueling quest. For example, the arena in Eye of the North, the Norn Arena. This could be a spot where faint-heartedness is much more appealing. But in general, it's okay, but there are other options that I prefer over it. Feast of Corruption. 15 energy, 2 second cast time, 20 second recharge, elite spell. Target foe and all adjacent foes, so it's area of effect, which is good, are struck for 67 shadow damage, so armor ignoring, and you steal up to 34 health from each struck foe who is suffering from a hex. This is very solid, but I don't tend to bring this. Again, going into Necromancer for damage is just not what I'm doing most of the time. This does play nicely with like Desecrate enchantments and stuff, and it's nice to have a reward for applying hexes to enemies. And it is area of effect, so it's pretty solid from those standpoints. 20-second recharge is a little bit long, but it is dealing 101 armor ignoring damage at these stats, and you can definitely bump that up to like quite a bit higher by getting your curses much higher. So I think this is a perfectly serviceable skill. I'm going to give it a 3. Again, I just don't use it very much. There are other things that I'm doing with the Necromancer than doing damage. But, you know, I don't hate this choice. You do need to make sure you're getting hexes on everything. It does play well with Suffering. It also plays well with water magic. So if you have a water magic elementalist, remember that like Deep Freeze will count for the hex for this. So that's just something important to remember. So yeah, perfectly serviceable skill. Great to have reward for hexing things, which is what Curses is often about. So I am quite fond of that. Insidious Parasite. This is 15 energy, 1 second cast time, 12-second recharge, hex spell for 13 seconds. Whenever target foe hits with an attack, you steal up to 39 health from that foe. So this is Empathy. This is the Necromancer version of Empathy. The thing is, I prefer Empathy. It costs less energy. It deals more damage. It reduces the damage they deal. Now, obviously, if they're attacking you, this is going to be reducing damage by 39, which is going to be more than Empathy reduces damage by. But Empathy deals more damage, and the recharges are fairly similar. I am in the current secondary profession that I am for a reason, but basically, most of the time I prefer Empathy if I'm going to be trying to apply a single target effect like this. This is quite a lot of energy. I do like this in, again, one-on-one scenarios, so like that Norn Arena is a really good spot for it. And also against like Shiro Tagachi. This is really good against him because, again, it just is an additional damage. Like, I would stack this with Empathy on him and spoil Victor and just have him kill himself. It's really, really effective there. So I like this in those sorts of scenarios. So I'm going to give this a 2. I don't bring it most of the time, but it does have some cases where it's really useful. And I appreciate this style of Necromancer Punisher effect. Oh. Lingering Curse. 15 energy, 1 second cast time, 10-second recharge, elite hex spell for 25 seconds. Target foe and all nearby foes suffer -2 health degeneration and receive 20% less benefit from healing. So this and its non-elite version, Suffering. So Suffering is the same thing. Like, I think it's even the exact same stats. 15 energy, 1 second cast time, 10-second recharge. Yeah, the exact same stats. The only difference is Suffering does not have the health, the healing debuff. That said, I'm going to bring Suffering before I bring Lingering Curse. Lingering Curse used to have a much different effect, but it was made into elite version of Suffering. But they're both nearby. They're huge area of effects. They're really great in sort of that hexy, pressury type build. I really like them for that. They're really cool for that. That is kind of a specific build. I'm okay with Lingering Curse, but you really need to have at least 13 curses to use it. Bumping it from -2 health regeneration to -3 is such a substantial benefit. And I'm only really going to bring it with Suffering because that 20% reduction in healing, unless I'm going into an area where that's a problem, where enemies' healing is something I really need to decrease, that's just not a big enough benefit to spend my elite slot on this. However, stacking this with Suffering is a really great way of getting -6 health degeneration on a big area of effect of enemies. So I really like it for that setup. I'm going to give this a 2 as a result. It's a high 2 in that I like it a good bit, but there are very specific circumstances for me required for me to bring it, either where reducing the healing is more valuable, or where I'm bringing with Suffering and I'm making that sort of build. This is not a skill that I'm just going to toss on my bar, typically speaking. So, Malaise. Malaise is 5 energy, 2-second cast time, 2-second recharge, hex spell for 29 seconds. That's pretty long compared to its recharge. Target foe suffers -1 energy degeneration, and you suffer -1 health degeneration. If target foe's energy reaches 0, that foe takes 41 damage and Malaise ends. Okay, so you are spending 2 HP per second to reduce their energy regeneration by 1/3 per second. Now, obviously, there's an order of magnitude difference, so it's kind of an okay trade. But the thing is, this is costing the enemy 10 energy. That's what this does. And then they take some additional damage if their energy is out. This can be okay in the energy denial build, more for the additional damage that it can deal on that fairly low recharge of 2 seconds. So about every 4 or 5 seconds, you could get the damage if they are out of energy, because you apply this. Yeah, you need something else to trigger it, though, because there is no profession that inherently is going to have this drop their energy. Like, this is not making their energy decrease, it's making it recharge less quickly. And that's really important to note. So while they do lose out on 10 energy, it's not the same thing as like an energy burn or an energy surge, which knocks that energy off all at once. It's just not that strong. This is a very, very weak spell. It does apply some attrition, and it can play a role in that sort of energy pressure-y build. That's a very particular build, and this is dubious even in that. So I am going to give this a 2, because I do think it could have a little bit of a space in that build just because of the damage trigger at the end, which serves the dual purpose of letting you know that they're out of energy and also applying more damage to them. And the fact that it has a very low recharge is great for that. I might like it a little bit better on a Mesmer, because the 2-second cast time means fast casting will speed up that cast time. But I don't like this. I'm never going to just bring this. I like where the effect is going and the sort of playstyle it's going into. It's just, it turns out it's much better to just kill your enemies dead than to drain them of energy. So unless draining their energy is an important part of making them weak enough to crumble, and melees is even a dubious part of that, so yeah, that's quite questionable. Cool effect, though, in terms of like what it's playing into and flavorfully what it is. The fact that it gives you health degen, I'm not a big fan of. I don't know why this needs to give you health degen. That just seems questionable. And that much energy degen is just not that valuable. And that's one of the weird things about this game. It treats energy regeneration and degeneration as being more valuable than they are. So I wish a lot of that stuff had been like reevaluated some. Mark of Pain. But on the other hand, like, energy is kind of the backbone for the pacing of the game, so you kind of do want to treat it as like being a little bit special. So it's just there's a lot of raw effects that way outpace anything that any of the regeneration-based effects do, and the regeneration-based effects feel like they're being balanced as if the regeneration effect on energy meant more than it does. It's just one. It's one energy every 3 seconds. So anyway, Mark of Pain is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20-second recharge, hex spell. For 30 seconds, whenever target foe takes physical damage, Mark of Pain deals 34 shadow damage to adjacent foes. I believe this does not affect the foe it is on. I'm not 100% certain on that. But either way, this is a nice way of getting additional damage out. In an area of effect. It plays well with minions, it plays well with an order build, that sort of thing. But you do have to be kind of building around it some. I'm going to give it a 2. I'm going to give it a little bit of a high 2 in my mind. I don't bring this very often, but I've been reasonably impressed with it when I do, because it does, like, that damage can add up. Especially with like minions in high armor and things like that, where like you throw this on a destroyer and your minions attacking it are dealing 6 damage and 34 damage to everything around them, things like that. That can work out really, really well. So definitely like worth considering, but not like an auto include for me. Meekness. Meekness is 17% health sacrifice, 15 energy, 2 second cast time, 15-second recharge. Again, to reiterate, that is percent max health, not percent current health. It is a hex spell for 25 seconds. Target foe and all foes in the area attack 50% slower. So it's really important to compare this to Shadow of Fear, which at first blush appears to have very similar stats, except for the fact that Meekness costs 5 more energy and 17% of your maximum HP. The difference is Shadow of Fear is adjacent and Meekness is in the area. Meekness has a significantly larger area of effect, but it also has a longer recharge and other things. So I actually prefer Shadow of Fear over Meekness. The decreased cost and recharge time is, to me, preferable to the increased area of effect on Meekness. That said, I think Meekness is perfectly serviceable. I'm going to give it a 3. these slower attack effects are actually quite strong. Because keep in mind, what they are effectively doing is they're having the damage from attacks, right? And so having that damage really does, reduce the pressure that you're taking. It also reduces the rate at which they're gaining adrenaline, obviously. So it's going to spread that stuff out further. So these are great for reducing the damage that you take over time, as it were. So I definitely like these effects, and they're worth bringing. I just prefer Shadow of Fear over Meekness because of the cost differences. So, but I can totally see why somebody might prefer Meekness over Shadow of Fear just because of the larger area of effect. So it is up to you which you prefer. That said, a lot of the melee attackers and stuff like that are going to clump up, so Shadow of Fear does a pretty good job of covering them. Order of Apostasy. 25 energy, 2 second cast time, but no recharge. 25 energy means that you cannot spam this, however, because even for a Necromancer, 25 is a lot of energy. So this is an elite enchantment spell for 5 seconds. Whenever a party member hits a foe with physical damage, that foe loses 1 enchantment. For each monk enchantment removed, you lose 17% maximum health. Where to begin? So this only lasts for 5 seconds. This is basically, I mean, it's an order, right? It's Order of Apostasy. It's like the orders in Blood Magic, Acceptance, and Curses for some random reason. I don't know why they're going around throwing it in a different area, but I guess Curses has more to do with removing enchantments. It's kind of like Rend enchantments, right? This removes enchantments, and if you remove monk enchantments, there's a little bit of animosity between monks and necromancers for some reason, despite the fact that like necromancers are basically worshipping the god of death, Grenth, and monks are worshipping the god of war, Balthazar, or more commonly, Duena, who's kind of opposed to Grenth, but also his mother or something. I'm not quite clear on the pantheon in regards to some of those relationships, but anyway, you get some of this weird monk stuff. This is not a good skill. 25 energy is very high. This does require you to build around dealing physical damage, obviously, like the other orders. The other orders have better payoff. There are many, many, many other ways of getting rid of enchantments that I prefer over this one, such as the next spell, and even then, there are many non-elite versions, many non-elite skills for removing enchantments that I prefer over Order of Apostasy. This is so expensive at 25 energy. Most of the time you are wanting to remove monk enchantments anyway. Those are the ones that are most useful to remove, aside from certain situations. Basically, the enchantments you want to remove are the ones that prevent the enemy from dying, bluntly put. And there are some enchantments that prevent the enemy from dying in the Elementalist line in Earth Magic. There are some dervish ones in like Earth Prayers and stuff like that that also make the enemy harder to kill. But most of the time it's monk enchantments, so losing 17% of your maximum HP whenever that happens sucks. I don't like this one. I'm going to give this one a 1. I don't know when I'd ever bring it. This is so energy intensive. This is so energy intensive. Yeah. No. No. Yep. That's... I see the design space it's playing around in. But it is competing for your elite slot. It's competing against Desecrate enchantments and Pain of Disenchantment, which we'll see next, which are both elite enchantment removal. It is competing against Rip enchantment, which you can see down below in the line, which is non-elite enchantment removal. It's competing with Mirror of Disenchantment, which is non-elite enchantment removal. It's competing with a bunch of Assassin enchantment removal, which can be preferable. Some Dervish enchantment removal, which is preferable. This is fighting really against overwhelming odds for enchantment removal that your party is using. And it is losing badly in that fight. It costs too much and does too little. And like one of the things is you want to be able to remove blocking enchantments. That's one of the big categories of enchantments you want to be able to remove. So things like Guardian, things like critical defenses, an Assassin enchantment that blocks. I mentioned Guardian, Aegis. Some of these blocking enchantments, Mirage Cloak, for example, are ones that you want to remove. This does not help with that. You have to bring stuff that gets through block to combine with this. It's all questionable, and I can just bring like Mirror of Disenchantment and get rid of like Aegis from the entire enemy party like that, and it's, yeah, way better. That said, this does allow you to power through enchantments, I guess, but man, the cost is so high. Pain of Disenchantment. So like, basically, just to kind of conclude my thoughts here while I'm thinking about them, this is hard to make good use of even without the huge costs associated with it, and I'm not even bringing this even if it had like 3% health sacrifice and was like 5 energy, because it's not worth my elite slot for this particular effect, for this way of removing enchantments. I want other things for it. It might be okay at those stats at like 5 energy and like 3% health, maximum health sacrifice or something like that, but that's very questionable. I feel like these are stats made to make it unplayable in PvP because it would be too strong otherwise. And that's just like, why does this skill exist then? There's a small chance I'd consider it at like 10 energy non-elite, but even that is questionable. Okay, Pain of Disenchantment. This is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 15-second recharge. So the 15-second recharge is a fine spot to be in because this is enchantment removal. It is an elite spell. Target foe loses 3 enchantments. If an enchantment was lost in this way, that foe and all adjacent foes lose 82 health. So this is basically an elite shatter enchantment. That area of effects on the damage from the shatter and removes more enchantments. The problem here is it does take up your elite slot. If you're going into an area with a lot of enchantments, particularly with enemies that stack enchantments, such as the Madness Titans that I mentioned earlier, this could be a perfectly reasonable and potentially quite useful skill to bring. Otherwise, I'm not typically bringing it. Again, elite enchantment removal is really, really hard sell. It needs to do more than that, and this does do more. This does do damage, so I'm going to go ahead and give this a 3 just because it does do damage in an area of effect at reasonable stats otherwise. And removing 3 enchantments is a nice bonus. So I don't really... I'm not going to bring this most of the time, but I don't dislike the idea of bringing it. So Parasitic Bond. This is 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 2 second recharge for a hex spell. For 20 seconds, target foe suffers -1 health degeneration. Reminder, that is 2 HP per second. The caster is healed for 102 when Parasitic Bond ends. So either when that enemy dies, or if Parasitic Bond is removed, or after the 20 seconds expires. So this is like the cover hex because it means so little and it being removed heals you. A cover hex is so removal skills remove the most recently applied X. So if you apply a really good hex, you can follow it up with Parasitic Bond. So that way, if the that target, that hexed foe, has a hex removed, Parasitic Bond is, quote, above, unquote, the hex you care about. Because you don't care if Parasitic Bond is removed. It has a 2 second recharge, it's super cheap, and it heals you when it's removed. That's fine. So because of that, like, you are perfectly happy to have this removed, or perfectly okay with it being removed. You spent 5 energy to heal yourself and stop the hex that you wanted to keep on the enemy from being removed. Cool. Problem. This is PvE that we're talking about. Cover hexes aren't really a thing in PvE. Like, you can technically do them. Like, it is functionally a thing, but it's not a concern. It's not a consideration because that's not how the AI works. This is much better in PvP for that purpose. That's where it's really the cover hex. So I'm not overly fond of this in PvE. That the degen it does is negligible. Like I said, that's 2 HP per second. This works out to 40 damage after 20 seconds, and then you get healed for a nice bit of health for a nice chunk. And the healing is nice, but again, it takes a long time to manifest. This is a really nice, simple hex. I like it from a design standpoint. It's approachable, it's understandable, things like that. You want some of those skills, but it's a very unexciting hex. So I'm going to give this a 2. I'm not going to bring this most of the time. It requires some specific circumstances. I'm not like upset to have it on my bar per se, but it's going to be doing very little. It's going to be very underwhelming. It could be a nice offset to health sacrifice if you could reliably get it to trigger shortly after you sacrifice health before your healers heal you, but that's not reliable at all. So here we are. It's got some specific uses, but that's being a cover hex, which doesn't matter in PvE. Moving on, Plague Sending. 10% max HP sacrifice, 1 energy, 1 second cast time, 5 second recharge, which is really nice and low. So all of these Plague skills, Plague Sending, Plague Signet, and Plague Touch, transfer, quote, negative, unquote, conditions from you to enemies. I don't know why it says negative. There's no positive conditions. That's an old standby because this is an old prophecies. Like, all of these are old prophecy skills. So they all say negative conditions for some reason. Plague Sending will transfer up to 3 conditions and their remaining durations. So if they've gone down, they will be down. It's not the original duration that they're applied for, so however long they're currently lasting. It'll transfer them and their remaining durations from yourself to target foe and all adjacent foes. So this is an area of effect way of doing this. I give this thing a 2. The thing is, you really have to kind of build around these effects. The reason why, and like technically, so if I were to drain all of my curses, I'm pretty sure this would send 1, and this would send 1 at the minimum end. That could be okay if you want to like get rid of crippled from yourself and put it on your target and things like that. But these are all kind of tricky to use. Most likely you have healers with you that can remove conditions, so having conditions on you to remove them can be kind of dubious. It can be useful on like a physical attacker to try to, like I mentioned, get rid of something like blind or crippled or weakness, things like that, to be able to ship them off to your enemies. And the recharge and energy costs are nice and low on that. But this is a questionable way of dealing with conditions. Alternatively, it works really well with sort of the draw condition mechanic, which we will be talking about in much more detail when we get to Soul Reaping. But Plague Sending is just... it's not a skill that I'm going to be using very often, but it is an alternative way of dealing with conditions that gets them off of you to enemies. So I guess it might be worth consideration. Maybe it's a little bit more than a 3, but I'm not sure. I feel like it's a very suspect way of dealing with conditions. So I'd need to play with it more, honestly, to get a feeling if I actually think it's okay on like a Necromancer secondary, some sort of physical attacker. Because it's going to be the physical attackers who want this the most, right? There is some dubious attempts to apply conditions to yourself in order to send them to enemies. So, for example, Poisoned Heart right here poisons you. Chillblains poisons you. There's like some signets. There's a signet that causes you to bleed for 25 seconds. I think a Signet of Agony up in Blood Magic. The thing is, applying those to yourself to send them is a very particular build choice and not as effective as one would like. So they're kind of finicky. So that's kind of my thoughts here. Plague Signet is going to be kind of similar thoughts. So Plague Signet is 1 second cast time, 4 second recharge. It is an elite Signet, which is a huge downside, by the way. Transfer all negative conditions with 180% of the remaining durations from yourself to target foe. 50% chance failure with curses 4 or less. If it did not have that failure clause, you could just go no investment in curses and just be like, here, I don't care how long these last. Have all of them. So this is at range. It is single target. It takes up your elite slot. I don't like this as much as Plague Sending or Plague Touch because it takes up your elite slot. Being able to transfer all of the negative conditions from you and making them last longer is nice, but it's not elite slot nice. That's the problem. So this can be dubiously okay with sort of the draw conditions type effect, which pulls conditions from allies to yourself, to be clear. But this is not an exciting way of doing that. So I'm not a big fan of Plague Signet. I just feel like Plague Sending and Plague Touch do that effect without taking up my elite slot, so I'm perfectly happy to run those. So I'm going to give this guy a 1. Not because the effect is, like, bad, but just because it's an elite. And Plague Sending exists. And Plague Touch exists. So I'm going to use those over this. That's really what it comes down to. Plague Touch. This is 5 energy, 3/4 second, cast time, no recharge. Really obnoxious when enemies have it. It is also a skill. That's actually relevant. Something I should mention with Plague Signet is it does let you get rid of Dazed from yourself without it being able to be easily interrupted because it is a Signet. Plague Touch is the same way. This is a skill. It transfers 3 negative conditions and the remaining durations from yourself to target touched foe. This is touch ranged. This works well on melee attackers because you're probably going to be in that range. That said, there is an argument for Plague Sending in that it costs even less energy and can more easily get rid of Crippled from you. Plague Touch will suffer in getting rid of Crippled just from the standpoint that if you're crippled, you can't catch up with enemies. But Plague Touch is a nice way of dealing with things like blind and stuff like that. I generally will choose Antidote Signet over it. Just cure it rather than trying to transfer it. This does require you to get up to an enemy and that sort of thing. But that said, this is a nice way of getting rid of those. I'm not going to use this on a primary Necromancer. I'm going to use it on a secondary Necromancer. It does transfer at least one condition, and I believe this actually originally didn't have any attribute scaling. But it does transfer at least one condition, even at 0 investment. So you can kind of get away with having fairly low investment in curses and using Plague Touch. Actually, if I scroll this down, I'm kind of curious. So 3 curses is 1. Okay, so once you get 4 curses, it transfers 2. So it's not unreasonable to get like 4 or 5 curses and transfer 2 conditions. You might want to get up to 5 curses if you're doing that. Because that breakpoint is at 4, weakness lowers all of your attributes by 1, and that would make it so that we could only transfer 1 condition. So if you want to keep the 2, getting it up to 5 would be beneficial. I'm just checking when it goes up to 3. It looks like it requires quite the investment to get up to 3. Okay, it does require the full 12 to get up to 3. So, yeah, if I'm secondary, I'm not needing to invest very much in curses to be able to get Plague Touch to be reasonable in terms of transferring 2. It works with Headbutt to get the dazed off of you onto an enemy. That's a thing you can do. It's kind of questionable. Headbutt requires so much energy. Headbutt is really, really questionable skill anyway. But this is a 2 for me. You're kind of, like, you can work with it. Keep in mind, trying to build around inflicting conditions on yourself and then applying them to enemies does mean you have to intentionally deprive your party of condition removal. That's questionable. I think you could do some interesting things with Foul Feast, Plague Touch on, like, a warrior. It would be strange, but I think you could do something like that. Probably better on, like, an assassin or a dervish. But if it's on a dervish, though, at that point you're better off with some other wind prayer skills that transfer conditions, possibly. But anyway, I ramble. I like this mechanical space that the plague skills are playing around in, though. I think that's a really interesting mechanical space. It's exploring, what if we take the downside of inflicting conditions on myself and turn it into an upside? What if we turn it into a way to inflict conditions on my enemies? That might be useful, right? And it's playing around in that space. I think that's a really cool space to play around in. And it does provide you additional options for dealing with conditions that enemies apply to you as well. And I appreciate the approach that's taking, and I think that's a really cool way of doing it. It's just they are a bit particular, and in general, I'm going to want to just bring condition removal and not mess with this sort of stuff. So, Poisoned Heart. 5 energy, 1/4 second cast time, 12 second recharge, spell. You and all adjacent foes are poisoned for 13 seconds. This is kind of underwhelming to me. Poison is just not that amazing. I would rather, like, apply poison and then use an area of effect attack, like and whatnot. But this could be okay with like the Plagued Touch type build or something like that. I would want to use this on a melee attacker, though, not on a Necromancer primary. Or, like, if I'm using it on a Necromancer primary, I'm using a melee weapon, is kind of what I mean by that. I'm just not a big fan. Inflicting poison is nice, but the fact that you put it on yourself means you have to try to do shenanigans to get rid of it, or you're costing additional energy to get rid of it. There are other ways of inflicting poison on groups of enemies. I would rather go with those than with Poisoned Heart. I'm going to give this a 2. I think you can try to do some stuff with it, but it's an interesting space of like, oh, I'm all poisoned and now all you are too, sort of thing. It's kind of how it feels like it's going. It plays with Plague Sending, technically, but it's... I just don't feel like this does enough to really be worth bringing. So that's kind of what it comes down to. Price of Failure. This is another nice hex to put on Shiro Togachi. It is 15 energy, 2-second cast time, 20-second recharge hex spell. For 30 seconds, target foe has 25% chance to miss with attacks and takes 37 damage whenever that foe fails to hit in combat. So there are a lot of reasons why they may fail to hit. This is the damage counterpart to a Mesmer hex that I talked about in the Mesmer video. That's... I forget exactly what it does, but basically whenever they miss, you gain energy. I forget the exact name, but it's an inspiration magic. It's also something of failure. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. This one's arguably a little bit better just because dealing damage can be better than gaining energy. It does have pretty long duration. It combos really nicely with blind or lots of blocks or things like that cause the enemy to fail to hit and therefore take damage. It is single target, though. It also plays really well with Reckless Haste, which we will talk about next. You'll see why when we talk about that. But Price of Failure is kind of expensive at 15 energy. It does have a long duration, and that's why. This is, to me, it's a 3. It's a perfectly serviceable skill, but like it has a hard time fitting on my bar because it's single target and stuff like that. So it's a neat space to play around with, though, of like, hey, I'm going to make you able to do the thing, and then I'm going to punish you if you do the thing. But it also applies to all other instances when you do the thing. So I appreciate that. It's not just like that foe has 25% chance to miss with attacks and take 37 damage or whatever. But like the 37 damage is whenever they fail to hit in combat, regardless of whether or not it's Price of Failure that caused it. And that I like, because that's a nice way of like, okay, I can see obviously how this reward builds into the effect that Price of Failure has, but oh wait, this combos with other things like if I'm blocking or if I inflict blind or things like that, blurred vision, stuff to stack their mischance, and that sort of comboing potential, that where the skill works on its surface and you can see that, but then you're like, oh wait, this can mix and match with stuff. That's really cool. That's some really good design. And I really appreciate that. That's the sort of thing that we want to see in stuff like this, because it makes it do more than just it appears on the surface, and that's really good. So Reckless Haste, like I said, this works really well with it. This is 15 energy, 1-second cast time, 12-second recharge hex spell. For 11 seconds, target foe and all adjacent foes are hexed with Reckless Haste. While hexed, they attack 25% faster, but have a 50% chance to miss with attacks. So this works really well with Price of Failure, as I mentioned, because it means that they miss more, but they also attack more, so it's going to trigger Price of Failure more often. And that's really what you want to do with this. You want to take advantage of the fact that they're attacking faster to use things that trigger on enemies attacking. Spiteful Spirit. Spiteful Spirit and Reckless Haste are good pals, because making the enemies attack faster means that Spiteful Spirit, which triggers off of every attack regardless of whether or not they hit, it means it hits harder, it deals more damage. Not hits harder, but it hits more frequently. So it deals more damage, but you don't take more damage because they're missing so much. This also works really well with Empathy, because Empathy, I believe, is on attack, not on hit. It does not work with Insidious Parasite, because Insidious Parasite is triggering off of hits, so just keep that in mind. Also, like I mentioned, works nicely with Price of Failure. So Reckless Haste, do not bring Reckless Haste and Shadow of Fear or Meekness or whatever on the same bar or the same team build. That's contradicting yourself, right? Reckless Haste is making them attack faster, and then Shadow of Fear is making them attack slower. they're at odds with each other, so you don't bring them on the same bar. I don't bring this a ton, but I am going to give this a 4 because this is a really good effect with Spiteful Spirit, which is phenomenal. So, absolutely worth considering this for those sorts of effects. Now, that brings us to Rend Enchantments. I've mentioned this one before, actually. A couple of times, but this is 5 energy, 2-second cast time, a little long, 20-second recharge, a little long, but 5 energy is nice. Spell, remove 8 enchantments from target foe, which is almost basically the same thing as remove all enchantments from target foe. For each monk enchantment removed, you lose 31 health. So the losing health kind of sucks, but it is a discrete number. It's not a percentage like Order of Apostasy was. This is a really good way of getting rid of a huge stack of enchantments on somebody. But, and you knew there was a but, 2-second cast time, especially the 20-second recharge, this for me gets a 2. Because I'm not going to bring this unless I know the enemies I'm going to be facing have stacks of enchantments I'm going to want to remove. It's got a longer recharge. So we're 2 skills away from Rip Enchantment. Rip Enchantment, you can already see by looking at it, it's 5 energy with 15-second recharge, 1-second cast time. That also removes an enchantment. Mirror of Disenchantment is 5 energy, 1-second cast time, 15-second recharge. Remove an enchantment from that foe and that same enchantment from all other foes in their party. There are other options for removing enchantments that have that 15-second recharge. So if you're getting above that 15-second recharge, once you're in that 20-second recharge territory, you have to be doing something I want. And Rend Enchantments right here absolutely does do something I can want. Removing stacks of enchantments, absolutely something I will want to do sometimes, but not very often. So this is a very powerful bullet for very specific circumstances, but bluntly, those are not common circumstances. So it's a 2. Rigor Mortis. 10 energy, 1-second cast time, 20-second recharge, hex spell. For 18 seconds, target foe cannot block. So this actually has almost 100% uptime, which is really interesting. The fact that it's a single foe makes me not as excited by it. So here's the thing. I'm going to give this a 2. This is a really strong counter to blocking. Obviously, because it just straight up says no. But it straight up says no to one target. And the thing is, I can get rid of the blocking other ways as well. So if it's blocking through an enchantment, I can bring enchantment removal. That's going to be more broadly applicable. If they're blocking through a stance, I can bring stance removal. That's maybe not as broadly applicable, but a lot of the stance removal has a much lower recharge than 20 seconds. Or can do some area of effect stuff too. If you're wielding a scythe, which there's a couple of stance removal skills that work with scythe. So Rigor Mortis is an extremely powerful way to counteract blocking. But there are other ways of counteracting the source of blocking, and I generally will prefer to do that. That's really the main mark against this. The other thing is, if enemies are not blocking, I have no reason to bring this. So that's another thing. Only bring this if the area you're going into is one that has enemies that are going to be blocking. Otherwise, you're just bringing a skill that doesn't do anything. Rip Enchantment. I've mentioned this one a couple of times as well. This is 5 energy, 1-second cast time, 15-second recharge. Spell, remove 1 enchantment from target foe. If an enchantment was removed, that foe suffers from bleeding for 21 seconds. This one's perfectly fine. I actually prefer Mirror of Disenchantment because it has the same stats, but can remove multiple copies of the same enchantment, which is more valuable to me than inflicting a somewhat lengthy bleed. That said, this is a 3 for me. This is perfectly serviceable enchantment removal, and it's one that I happen to like reasonably well in Necromancer. Sorry, my 3 is a little wonky. You ever ride a 3 and it looks more like a 2? Anyway, so Rip Enchantment I'm perfectly happy with. It's enchantment removal that I'm fine with bringing, but Mirror of Disenchantment is just so good. It doesn't require any attributes and all that sort of thing, so it's kind of hard to dethrone that one for me for just like general, it's in my party, I want to remove enchantments. I also prefer like Drain Enchantment because it has benefits for the one draining with the energy gain and the health gain and that sort of thing. So Bleed is just not enough of an upside to make me want this over some of the upsides of others, but I'm happy with it. I'm not upset with it. Shadow of Fear I talked about a little bit with Meekness. It is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 5-second recharge, hex spell, target foe, and all adjacent foes. Again, Meekness was, I think, in the area. It's way up here. Yeah, in the area, so it's a much, much bigger area of effect, but this has a shorter recharge and less energy. So anyway, the target foe and all adjacent foes attack 50% slower for the next 25 seconds. So this one I like. Keep in mind, you do not want to bring this with Reckless Haste, and Reckless Haste plays well with things like Spiteful Spirit. I'm going to give this a 4. I do have a tendency to bring it, but just know that... in general, if I'm going to be bringing Spiteful Spirit, which is likely, this loses out to Reckless Haste in terms of like affect enemies attacking. And Blurred Vision also is nice to have along with. Regardless, actually, it's nice to have along with either one. But because Shadow of Fear and Reckless Haste are doing opposite things, and the thing that Reckless Haste does is better with Spiteful Spirit than what Shadow of Fear is, that does ding this a little bit. But I like this enough, and I feel like I've historically brought this enough that I do want to give it a 4. So, okay. Now we get to Shivers of Dread, the factions version of Spinal Shivers. Because this spell apparently was... So I'm going to be blunt. I have absolutely no idea why they thought it was worth making a second one of this spell. It is complete boggling to me. So 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge hex spell. For 34 seconds, whenever target foe is struck for cold damage while using a skill, that foe is interrupted and you lose 6 energy, or Shivers of Dread ends. So I think you can see why I have such a low view of these. You have to build around dealing cold damage. This can potentially drain your energy really quickly. I am going to actually give these both a 2. Shivers of Dread and Spinal Shivers. I have not really played with these. I don't like them at all, because I do feel like this is really awkward. Like, it's going to potentially drain you a bunch of energy. You are a Necromancer, so you can absorb some amount of energy cost, but let's be honest, this is better on an Elementalist, where you have a bigger energy pool. I don't generally like this effect. That said, I did mention that a number of the bonus weapons, the slash bonus stuff that you can get from like pre-order bonuses and things like that, are cold damage. The Glacial Blade and the Icy Soulbreaker of Enchanting specifically. With the latter of those being the better because it's a scythe. I could see bringing something like Shivers of Dread in the circumstance where I have that going on against specific bosses, like Elementalist bosses or things like that, where I want to be able to interrupt what they're doing. Because this is kind of like applying a pseudo-dazed. It's not quite as good, and I think something like Broadhead Arrow is better, but I can see this being okay in that scenario. I'm still probably never bringing it, but I'm being generous and coming up with a situation in which I'd bring these over, consider bringing these and therefore not give them a 1. There's a thought. So I don't like this effect because it does cost you potentially a bunch of energy if you're interrupting things. Now, that could be worth it, obviously. The losing 6 energy or spending like 10 energy to interrupt it with Cry of Frustration, well, obviously losing 6 energy is preferable to that. But it is that specific foe that you're trying to shut down, so... I could see this doing okay, but I just feel like for general PvE purposes, this is going to be kind of awkward. I'd rather do something like Broadhead Arrow and Epidemic to kind of spread it around and things like that to be able to get dazed on multiple enemies. This only affects one enemy at a time, obviously, because it's target foe, not target foe and adjacent foes or whatever. There's no area of effect on it. So I'm not thrilled to bring this in general. Like, concocting the scenario for it is a little awkward. It is a cool effect. in that it's an interesting way of approaching this sort of thing, and this idea of you're making the enemy shiver and lose their ability to kind of focus because of taking cold damage. That's really cool. It's got really cool flavor there. But they are kind of awkward to use, and I feel like they're particularly awkward in PvE. And I really do not feel like I needed 2 of them. This to me is another. It's one of those skills where I really would like to ask Green, hey, why did you pick this skill to make a duplicate of in factions? It's just a very questionable choice in my opinion, as in I want to question that choice because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Soul Barbs. This is a unique effect. It is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 20-second recharge, hex spell. For 30 seconds, target foe takes 27 damage when an enchantment or hex is cast on that target. So what's really interesting to me about this one is it rewards you for hexing them and punishes them for being enchanted, or for getting enchanted. And I really like that odd place that it's playing around in that regard, in that it is both a reward to you for doing the thing and a punishment to them for the thing being done. For a different thing being done. So I really like that sort of design, and it hits a really neat spot in that, where it's kind of doing both things. That said, this can be okay if you're going into an area where there is a lot of enchanting going on, but I'm not going to bring this unless I'm specifically applying a lot of hexes. Now, this actually can be a bit better than it might appear on the surface, because if you're bringing like a Mesmer that applies a bunch of hexes, and Necromancers that are applying a bunch of hexes and things like that, you can get quite a few triggers off on this, and that can cause it to deal a pretty large amount of damage. Like, it's perfectly fine once you're getting 3 or 4 triggers off on it, because that's going to be like basically 70. Well, that's going to be like 81. Yeah, 81 to like 100 and 108 damage, things like that. So that's going to be a pretty sizable amount of damage if you're getting enough triggers off on it. So this one's kind of cool in that regard. I'm going to give it a 2. I really like the design space it's playing around in, but you do have to kind of build around it. You do have to be making sure that you're playing more of a hexy team build in order to be able to trigger it enough to really be worth it. That looks like an A, not a 2. No, wait. Sorry, I completely marked some wrong things. Anyway, so to me, Soul Barbs, it's a 2, because you do need to be either bringing it into an area where a lot of enchantments are flying around, or you're going to be bringing it with a lot of hexes, preferably both. But you definitely want to be bringing a lot of hexes, I think, with it. But it can do some good stuff then, and it is armor ignoring damage. It works nicely in later game areas where the enemies tend to have ludicrous amounts of armor. So certainly worth considering in those sorts of situations if you are bringing enough hexes. So it's a nice part of a hexing type build. Soul Bind. It is 10 energy, 1-second cast time, 5-second recharge, elite hex spell. For 30 seconds, every time target foe is healed, the healer takes 68 damage. This hex ends if the target is suffering from a smiting prayers hex. You might be scratching your head and saying, what? What is this clause about? Well, that's why I have 12 in Smiting Prayers. It's about Scourge Healing. Scourge Healing is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 5-second recharge. We'll talk about this a lot more with Monk, but it's important to read it now. Actually, let's do this. I'm going to throw Scourge Healing and Soulbind on my bar so we can kind of look at them side by side. So if you notice, this has 1 second longer cast time, but they both last 30 seconds. Scourge Healing is, for 30 seconds, every time target foe is healed, the healer takes 67 holy damage. Well then, these look almost identical. Slightly longer cast time, slightly less damage if 1 point matters to you. It doesn't to me. That's why this ends if the target is suffering from a Smiting Prayers hex. This is an elite version of Scourge Healing, and when I say elite version, I mean it is literally a copy of this spell that has been made elite and made casting slightly faster. And they didn't want these two to stack. They didn't want you to be able to do both of these at the same time. So here's the deal. I am going to bring, okay, so I will bring Scourge Healing for this effect over Soulbind almost every time. The only reason to bring Soulbind instead of Scourge Healing is if you don't want to be putting a bunch of points in Smiting Prayers in order to make effective use of this, or if you're getting Soulbind, your curse is up high enough that Soulbind is dealing a good bit more damage. but not taking up your elite slot is super valuable. So I don't know. The thing is, if you go into smiting prayers, you can also bring things like smite hex and smite condition, which for some reason this character doesn't have. But smiting hex, it provides some additional support that you could do with your team, along with Scourge healing. So these are a nice way to counter a lot of healing that could be going on. But to me, Soulbind is just a mostly inferior choice to Scourge healing. I'm going to give it a 2, just because I feel like I can concoct scenarios in my head where I might bring it, but keep in mind that if I want it, I'm probably going to bring Scourge healing instead, because they are almost exactly the same skill, except one is not an elite. The biggest knock against Scourge healing is that smiting prayers is generally kind of bad, although there's some asterisks around that too. We'll get to that when we talk about smiting prayers with Monk, which will be next week. Monk will be next. The next profession I talk about. Anyway, this effect is one that's really good to have in the game. It actively punishing healing like this is quite useful. It can be really nasty if you have this spread around some. Keep in mind, that's a 5-second cooldown. So if you get this on a couple of different people and then they use a skill that heals multiple of them, they can get suddenly spiked for a lot of damage. This effect can also be really good if you are running into an area where there's a lot of healing going on and you're really struggling with taking down that healing, and kind of spreading this around on stuff can help you whittle down those healers. You can also, however, of course, go for something like Lingering Curse to decrease the effectiveness of healing. So you have some options there. Soulbind is another way of trying to combat healing, and this sort of effect existing is really cool, and I appreciate it as a part of Necromancer and part of what Necromancer does. And the other thing is, it's a unique way that Necromancer is punishing things and punishing something that Mesmer doesn't, and so it creates some distinction between the professions. I like that. However, the fact that it's basically like, yeah, except this is something the monk does, and I'm kind of like pretending I do it by making it an elite and allowing myself to do it that way, kind of muddies that a little bit. So this is really something that the monk punishes, that the Necromancer is kind of like, okay, I guess I will try doing this too. But the monk does it better because it's not an elite, and that's always better. So, and if I want this effect, I might bring a Smiting Prayers monk, because you can set up a Smiting Prayers build that's quite powerful. It's just most Smiting Prayers are garbage. But that's a rant for next week. So, anyway, so Soulbind in a fine effect, but being elite really harms it. If this was area of effect, it would absolutely be worth it, by the way. If it was like target foe and adjacent foes are hexed with Soulbind, then it would be decidedly better than Scourge healing because of that, and that to me would elevate it up to elite status and would make it worth bringing instead of worrying about bringing Scourge healing if I'm wanting the effect. I want to note some of those ways that those can be different. Spinal Shivers I already talked about. Dubious skill. Spiteful Spirit is 15 energy, 2-second cast time, 10-second recharge. Popular with Arcane Echo. It is an elite hex spell for 18 seconds. Whenever target foe attacks or uses a skill, Spiteful Spirit deals 29 shadow damage to that foe and all adjacent allies of that foe. So this is area of effect, Punisher skill. This is a 5. This is a reason to bring a Necromancer in curses. It is so good. It is incredibly devastating. Again, that's 29 armor, ignoring damage whenever they basically do anything. Attacking or using a skill covers basically all actions that aren't moving. So this is very good damage. This quickly adds up. It works super well with Reckless Haste, because that makes them attack faster and therefore deal more damage to themselves and their allies. Like I said, plays well with Arcane Echo. So back in 2005, late 2005, I'm guessing, is when the AoE scatter was added. I don't remember exactly. It's something like that. When that was done, so what sort of the PvE mission meta in pickup groups and stuff was get yourself loaded up with elementalists, have them bring like Arcane Echo, Meteor Shower, drop those on enemies from spellcasting range, which is slightly outside aggro range, and the enemies would stand there like doofuses getting hit by Meteor Showers until they died. When they added AoE Scatter, that didn't work anymore, and all of a sudden elementalists fell completely out of favor. And what ended up happening is people were like, wait a minute, Spiteful Spirit, So they started using Spiteful Spirit. They Arcane Echoed it to be able to get multiple copies floating around and just like spam Spiteful Spirit on enemies, particularly enemies that were like trapped in alcoves and stuff. I particularly remember this being done in Abaddon's Gate, I want to say. Actually, the mission outpost that I am standing in right now, if I'm remembering correctly, where there are some, it's either that or it's Ring of Fire. But anyway, there's, no, I'm pretty sure it's this one. I'm rambling, but there's some ledges that enemies would stand on where they would, like, attack you as rangers and, like, attack you coming down, and so you'd, like, spread it on each of them, and they'd kill themselves really quickly. So people discovered the power of Spiteful Spirit at that time, and it's been, I think, a staple of Necromancer builds ever since, just because it is so effective at dealing damage. So, yeah, Spiteful Spirit. Strong stuff. Very, very good skill. Suffering. So Suffering is 15 energy, 1 second cast time, 10 second recharge, hex spell for 25 seconds. Target foe and all nearby foes suffer -2 health regeneration. I mentioned earlier that this is very similar to Lingering Curse. Lingering Curse just adds a 20% reduction in healing. Otherwise, it's identical. And just like that one, you really, 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 really want to do this with 13 curses because you want that -3 health regeneration. I will bring this before I bring that one. I might just slot this onto a bar. I'm going to give this a 3. Truth be told, I don't bring this very often. It does add up damage, and the big area is really nice, but unless you're specifically wanting hexes or you're trying to go for a pressure build, it's just not quite worth it, if that makes sense. It does do a good chunk of damage if you got a lot of enemies with it. With that, basically 6 times 25 is going to be 180 damage, right? Dealing 180 armor ignoring damage, applying that pressure like that, loading that up also with the other one, like they work really well together. This and Lingering Curse, that's really cool, and I really like that. That said, a lot of the times it's just better to just straight deal now damage and just kill the enemies than it is to load them down. The other thing that's worth mentioning, though, is Suffering also plays really well with Feast of Corruption, because this does need enemies to be hit, to be hexed, and Suffering is a nice big area of effect hex. So it's a fine choice. So yeah, I don't know. It's a nice simple effect too, so I really like it from that standpoint. It's good to have some of those in the game. Ulcerous Lungs. So I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Cacophony. This is 15 energy, 2 second cast time, 10 second recharge hex spell for 22 seconds. Target foe and all nearby foes, which is a pretty nice area of effect, suffer from -4 health regeneration when bleeding, and whenever they use a shout or chant, they bleed for 13 seconds. So this one's really interesting in that, like Price of Failure, the payoff, like it has a thing, right? Inflicts bleeding, makes the enemy miss, and then has a payoff for when that condition is true. In this case, -4 health regeneration. The other one is 37 damage. But what's really nice about this is it doesn't care how the enemy is bleeding. It's just going to apply that 4 health regeneration regardless of how they started bleeding. So this actually works really well if you are doing a build that is inflicting a lot of bleeding. So this can work really well in that sort of pressury type build. And I actually really like it in that sort of circumstance. That said, I'm going to give it a 2. I'm going to give it a 2 because... So you're bringing this not to punish the uses of shouts or chants, although it does it. That's a nice benefit. You're bringing this if you are making a build that's going to inflict a lot of bleeding, and this makes bleeding into burning, basically, in terms of the amount of health regen it does. It has a nice big area of effect, a good healthy duration of 22 seconds, and it's nice from that standpoint. It is more potent than Suffering if you are getting the bleed happening. So it's cool from that standpoint. I don't bring this very often, though, so And it really, you do need to be inflicting bleeding for this to be at all worth it. Because that's what it rewards, right? This is not for punishing shouts or chants. It's for rewarding inflicting bleeding, and it happens to have a bonus condition in which it inflicts bleeding itself. Vocal Minority. 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20 second recharge, hex spell for 17 seconds. Target foe and all nearby foes cannot use shouts or chants. This is a 2. It is, to be clear, extraordinarily powerful. If you want your enemies to not be able to use shouts or chants, this does just that, and it does it full stop. That is what it does. But that is all it does. I will not bring this most of the time, because most of the time I'm not combating enemies that are using shouts and chants that I care about. That's really what it comes down to. This was added to the game because of Paragons. I think this might be a Nightfall skill. It might be Eye of the North. But that doesn't matter. But the Paragons have shouts and chants. A lot of them involve buffing their allies. And there's no way to remove those. There's no specific counterplay inherent to the way shouts work. Chants have a cast time to them, and so they can be interrupted by things that can interrupt skills, or a bunch of Mesmer things that interrupted only spells had chants stapled onto them, so they could interrupt those as well. The issue really that happened is that shouts and chants were extremely strong. And actually, I'm now curious. I'm going to do this by campaign, just because I'm wondering. Actually, no. Eye of the North. Did this? No, Cacophony is Eye of the North. That's really weird. And that's Nightfall, huh? That's the reverse of what I would have expected, because Cacophony is so mediocre. But anyway, as I scroll up here, so because of how powerful that was, they wanted to add stuff that kind of, in my mind, this is like artificial hardcap countering, in that like it explicitly like says no, you can't do the thing. I don't always like no, you can't do the thing stuff like this. It's very similar to Soothing Images, which says no, you can't get adrenaline, right? And this is like no, you can't use shouts or chants. I prefer something that punishes the use of shouts or chants. So like Roaring Winds, which was the nature ritual that Rangers have, that causes shouts and chants to all cost an additional like 4 energy or whatever. That's, to me, a more interesting counter because it applies pressure to that build. You can, like, the build still works. The shout or chant-based build still works, which Vocal Minority basically says, no, it doesn't work. But it works way less effectively, way less efficiently. And that sort of downside, to me, is a more compelling, more interesting downside than just saying no. Something like Ulcerous Lungs or Cacophony are, to me, more interesting. They say, you can do this, but you shouldn't do this. And that, like, imagine every time you use a shout or chant, you're set on fire for 13 seconds. Like, that's nasty. Just saying no is a really straightforward way of introducing a card counter to something that has poor counterplay. Shouts happen instantly, so you can't interrupt them, I should say. You cannot remove them if they apply a buff, so you just kind of have to wait them out. And so they wanted to add this counterplay. They added this counterplay, but this is just a very uninteresting way of doing it. And it's a very potent way of doing it, but it's also like not terribly important to use a lot of the time. So I don't know. I don't like how this is implemented. The effect is strong at countering very specific situations, and if those situations aren't coming up, it's a worthless skill. Ulcerous Lungs is a lot more interesting in that regard. Weaken Armor. 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 5 second recharge, spell, target foe, and foes adjacent to your target have cracked armor for 17 seconds. I like this one as a source of cracked armor. There are a few other ways of getting cracked armor, but this is a really straightforward, reliable, solid way of doing it. And I quite like it because of that. I'm going to give this a 4. I don't always bring this, but when I bring in Necromancer, it's not uncommon for me to be putting, some points and curses and bringing Weaken Armor and Enfeebling Blood, because those are, they are simple, straightforward ways of AoE applying an extremely useful condition. Fun fact, Weaken Armor used to be a hex that reduced armor against physical damage by 20. One thing that I will say about that is I believe that could reduce armor against physical damage below 60, which would increase damage taken, as opposed to cracked armor, which cannot reduce armor below 60. Cracked armor is generally better because it just reduces all aspects of armor by 20 to a minimum of 60, and that helps against harder enemies that have like elemental armor and stuff like that. Softens them up a bit. But yeah, this is, if you're looking for a way of getting cracked armor, this is a fine way of doing it. It's reliable, and it does exactly that. So I'm happy to bring this, and often do. And it's good to have straightforward ways of applying things. So yay. Weaken Knees. 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 10 second recharge. Elite Hex spell for 13 seconds. Target foe suffers -3 health degeneration and takes 9 damage while moving. This one's an interesting one. First of all, you really want the enemy to be moving, because if they're not moving, 3 health degeneration is very unimpressive. I've said that repeatedly about bleed. 9 damage while moving. That's 9 damage per second while moving, to be clear. This doesn't make that clear. But that is equivalent to 4.5 pips of health degeneration, but it goes beyond the stack, beyond the cap. So health degen, I've mentioned this before, caps at 10, either way, actually. So you can either get plus 10 health regeneration or minus 10 health degeneration is usually how they word it, which is 20 HP per second, either losing or gaining. But it's capped, right? So if you have something that's applying a total of like 15 pips of health degeneration to you, that like does not actually go below 10. So the extra 5 don't do anything. This 9 goes outside of that, so it actually works. So suffering that additional 9 damage while moving, if you've reached the cap, that will go beyond it. That said, this is kind of a cute skill. It doesn't actually deal that much damage. If they are moving, that's going to be 15 damage per second. So at most, you can get some decent damage off of it, but it's a little unexciting. It's a little bit more interesting in PvP. I'm okay with this. I'm going to give this a 3, but it's kind of a low 3. I think it's an okay skill, but it's not terribly exciting or terribly interesting one. And its biggest knock is it's an elite. That elite slot is quite precious. It does become a little bit more interesting when you get up 13 curses and it's -4 health degeneration. That's definitely better. If it gets up to like 5 with high enough curses, which you can get up to 18 curses with Awaken the Blood, don't forget. That starts to become much more attractive. When it's like Conjure Phantasm with upside. But just at 12 curses is very, very unexciting. Well of Darkness. 10. So there's a bunch of wells here. This is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20 second recharge, well spell. Exploit nearest corpse to create a Well of Darkness for 41 seconds. Hexed foes within the Well of Darkness miss 50% of the time. So this is a nice way of adding some additional defense. The thing is, I think all of the Curse's wells, for the most part, are pretty reasonable in effect. We'll discuss each of them in turn, but I don't tend to bring them very often. Corpses are a limited resource, and often if there's corpses there and I'm bringing a Necromancer, I'm doing minions, which means I don't really want wells. Or I'm like bringing Well of Blood, maybe. I think I overlook these guys a little bit, because this is actually a really easy condition to meet. If you're bringing, like, Suffering obviously makes this work. It works really nicely with Reckless Haste, because they really have a lot of mischance there. It works nicely with Deep Freeze. So I think this is a nice solid 3 for me. It's an effect that I'm happy to bring. Like, I just don't. And maybe I should bring it some more times, because this does mean that, like, it's easy enough in Necromancer to, and in a party build in general, to be getting hexes on enemies, and Well of Darkness is a really nice way to get additional benefit out of those. And the thing is, this is quite long lasting. Like, if I'm going to bring Ward against melee, which is, melee attackers have 50% chance to miss, Well of Darkness is longer lasting. I just have to get an enemy down first. But then it's longer lasting, and I just have to keep hexes on things. But, that's something I'm going to want to do. So I actually think that this effect is pretty sweet and has some nice defensive synergies, a nice way that Necromancer can be in a supportive role in a way that's very Necromancery, which is something that I like to see. Well of Ruin. 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20 second recharge. A lot of these wells are 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20 second recharge, aren't they? This is a well spell. Exploit nearest corpse to create a well of ruin at its location. For 25 seconds, whenever a foe in the well takes physical damage, that foe has cracked armor for 17 seconds. This is an okay way of getting cracked armor. Physical damage is usually the time you're going to want to inflict it, so that's really nice. Plays well with things like body blow and body shot and body skills, apparently. That specifically have additional effects that trigger with cracked armor. Although I'd want to check to see if the cracked armor would apply in time for those to go off. I'm not entirely sure. But, I mean, you can just be auto-attacking. Like, auto-attack, use the skill. Oh, look. They got cracked armor from being auto-attacked. I think this is a reasonable way of getting cracked armor on things. I'm going to give this a 3 as well. Well. It's a perfectly serviceable way of getting additional cracked armor. That said, I kind of like weaken armor better for getting cracked armor on things, just because it doesn't require that corpse in the first place, and plays better with minions and things like that. But I think this is an okay way of doing it, so it's fine. Well of Silence. 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20 second recharge. Again, it's a well spell. Exploit target corpse to create a well of silence for 26 seconds. Foes within the well cannot use shouts or chants and suffer -3 health degeneration. So I actually like this a lot better than Vocal Minority. So if you remember, Vocal Minority also said foes cannot use shouts or chants. But the thing is, this is a hex that prevents it. This is a well. This creates an area where they can't do it, but they can step outside of it to leave the effect. This means that they can pay attention to the battlefield and get around it. I really like that, but at the same time, it also is a way to kind of stop those. But they also knew there's a very soft way of stopping shouts and chants, so they added some additional health degen to it, which is also really nice. I'm curious. Yeah, it gets up to 4 health degen at 13 curses, so I think you can get some really healthy degen off of this as well. It compares favorably. There is a death magic well called Well of Suffering, which just all that this does is health degen. And I think it compares favorably against that one, or at least reasonably well. I keep using the word well because that's the correct grammatical term, but also I'm talking about wells, and it's like every single time it catches my ear. So I think that this is another like perfectly fine skill. It does go up in value to me if I am specifically dealing with enemies that are using shouts and chants, because they might be too stupid to leave the well, and therefore I can shut down things like We Shall Return, which might be relevant as long as wells work in the areas where enemies are doing that. The Desolation, there's undead there, but I'm not sure if they're fleshy or not. So I'm going to give this another 3. I think it's fine. I'd be okay with running it. I just don't. So, I mean, that's really what it comes down to. That brings us to Well of Weariness. This is, and I bet you're all weary of hearing my voice at this point. Boy, I'm glad I'm splitting this up into separate videos, huh? So Well of Weariness is 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 5 second recharge. So it's very quick recharging, and very cheap. Not as quick as recharging as Well of Blood, but it is a well spell. Exploit target corpse to create a Well of Weariness for 46 seconds. Enemies within the Well of Weariness suffer -1 energy degeneration. So obviously this costs a lot of energy if they stand in for the entire duration. That's going to be roughly 15 energy they'd be missing out on. That said, like, don't stand in the well, obviously, if you're playing against this. I think this is interesting for enemies to use, in part because it works as a bit of counter to minion strategies, because it recharges fairly quickly, it is cheap to spam, and casts more quickly than minions do. As you can see, all of those animate skills in death magic just below the screen there with those 3 second cast time. So Well of Weariness does get off quicker. I have used this as a way to try to counter AI minions, like enemy minions in PvE. It's dubious. I would consider bringing this in some sort of energy denial team build, because this is a useful way of contributing to that. But by itself, I'm not bringing this. This is a 2. I think it is a role. It can be a bit of a role player in that energy denial type strategy. Bringing this to try to counter minions is a very dubious strategy, and I think you'd be better off bringing like Well of Blood or some of the other wells, or bringing some of the other death magic skills that interact with corpses to try to, or like bring your own minions, for example, to try to deal with that. I'm not thrilled to do this. Again, this just doesn't do very much in the quick nature of most PvE battles, so I don't have a good reason to want this most of the time. And the reason to bring it is because it will make it stat weights easier to push through enemies because they're going to run out of energy more easily. It doesn't make them lose energy in the sense of like, oh no, they just lost 5 energy. It makes them gain less energy, which is a significant difference, right? And that's really important to be aware of. So it does increase the rate at which they will attrition out, but for most of the time in PvE, that doesn't really matter. So I like where the effect plays and stuff, but it is a bit underwhelming in PvE. Would be interesting at a higher energy cost, but where the energy degeneration could scale up as well. So that way it could actually get some serious energy degen. If it could get up to 5 energy degeneration, man, that is hard to say, energy degeneration, it would start to cause energy to be lost and could keep energy down. That would be really, really powerful, but it would probably need to be like 15 energy to use at that point. Or maybe like 10 energy with that 20-second recharge that I like to be using, things like that. But that would be much more effective. So, yeah. Anyway, those are kind of my thoughts on Well of Weariness. Let's get to Wither, the last of the curses. Yay, we're almost done. We'll probably come in just under 2 hours on this one. There's been a lot to say. I'm trying to get into these a bit more game design analysis stuff. Hopefully that has been successful and been interesting. Anyway, Wither is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 10-second recharge, elite hex spell. For 29 lengthy seconds, target foe suffers -4 health degeneration and -1 energy degeneration. If target foe's energy reaches 0, that foe takes 63 damage and Wither ends. So this is an awful lot like Malaise. Again, the energy degeneration clause is not that big of a deal. It will make them not gain 10 energy basically over the course of it. This is okay from a health degen standpoint. So yeah, it's 4 even at 13. I'm not bringing this a lot of the time. I don't hate it, but like I kind of like Malaise mildly better in the energy denial type build. Depravity is decidedly better at reducing energy than Wither is. Wither does live up to his name, like it makes the enemy wither, but I kind of wish that energy degeneration could scale as well, so it could get up to 2 or even 3 degen at 12 curses. As it is, it's just it's unexciting. They can end it early by burning up all of their energy, obviously, as well, just by using skills. They'll take a chunk of damage, but you know, this is very unexciting to me. As an elite Malaise was unexciting to me. The elite is not adding enough. Like, it's transferring, instead of me having degen, the enemy now does. It is pretty lengthy, but again, PvE battles tend to end quickly. So this is a skill that's mildly more interesting in PvP, and even then I'm not really going to consider bringing it. So I'm going to give this a 2. I feel like it's a little bit more interesting than a 1, but not by much. It just does not do enough for me to really want it. There are other options if I'm going to just cause health degen for Necromancer elites, and I'd much rather bring Lingering Curse, for example, than this. So, or Depravity if I'm trying to go the energy denial route. So here we are. That covers curses. So until next time, everyone, take care. Goodbye.